This is time that we discuss T.COLERIDGE. Coleridge was basically a poet, but at the same time, he was a philosopher and a critic. But in the case of Wordsworth, he was basically a poet and not at all a critic. But Coleridge was slightly different. He was philosophic and critical also. The new critics followed the principles given by Coleridge. Coleridge's views on the external beautification of poetry were taken into consideration by the new critics. The movement started in America in the 1950s, and we come to find Crow Ransom, Robert Penwarren, Cleant Brooks, Alan Tate, and there were many people, and actually these people were inspired by the writings of Coleridge. Coleridge was a powerful critic and philosopher. He had his own views on literature. And the main critical contribution made by Coleridge is Biographia Literaria. And Biographia Literaria was also called autobiography in discourse. Actually, it has got 23 chapters. It's a long book, and it is published in 2 volumes. There are 23 chapters in 2 volumes. Wordsworth actually wanted to produce a preface to his collection called Sibylline Leaves. And he started writing a preface to be attached with his collection of poems entitled Sibylline Leaves. But the preface extended, and it later turned to become a big book in 2 volumes. And it came to be named Biographia Literaria. And the Biographia Literaria actually presents an autobiography in discourse. Actually, it speaks about the life of Coleridge also, his views on poetry and his meeting with his meeting with Wordsworth, and the various opinions and the controversies and the friendship also between Wordsworth and Coleridge are all discussed in Biographia Literaria. There are the haphazard descriptions. And Coleridge was a man who was absent-minded also. He may start the speech and may divert to another point and may not return to the point that he started. He may go to the other areas, and this is the haphazard presentation. And the Biographia Literaria can be called as a haphazard autobiography of the poet. The description is not properly oriented. There are many digressions found in Biographia Literaria, many deviations. In some occasions, he may begin with his youth and may shift it to philosophy, may speak about his childhood, may shift it to philosophy. And this is quite often we find in the Biographia Literaria. And Biographia Literaria was actually intended as a preface to be added to his collection of poems called Sibylline Leaves. And there he wanted to explain his style and practice in poetry. But it grew into an autobiography concerning his education and his early adventures. And it was an extended criticism of the preface attached to the lyrical ballads, and it appeared to be an answer to the preface produced by Wordsworth for the lyrical ballads. And the first part of Biographia Literaria speaks about his evolution of philosophy. Actually, Coleridge started associating with the philosophy of John Locke and David Hartley, which was called associational philosophy. That every idea or every experience may be in some way connected with the precedent experience or succeeding experience. All experiences, thoughts, feelings and emotions are in some way associated, and we can find there is association between the experiences, and this is what called associational philosophy. And associational philosophy is actually the outcome of empiricism and sensationism, and it was a philosophy presented by John Locke, David Hume, and the utilitarian thinkers like James Mill, John Stuart Mill. They all shared the associational philosophy, and Coleridge also believed in the associational philosophy in the beginning, but later he became disillusioned in the associational philosophy. And in Biographia Literaria we come to find him giving some special terms like exemplastic, and it's a very popular term associated with Coleridge. It was Coleridge who gave currency to the term exemplastic imagination or exemplastic power. Exemplastic power is the unifying power, unifying imagination, and it speaks about the mind's faculty to engage in imagination. It is called exemplastic power, and Coleridge gives his views on exemplastic power in Biographia Literaria, and we come to find him speaking about exemplastic power in chapter 13 of his Biographia Literaria, and he speaks about exemplastic imagination in the 13th chapter of his Biographia Literaria. And the term actually means shaping into one or unifying different things, and the unification of the imagination is actually the faculty of the mind, and the faculty of the mind is to be called the exemplastic power for unifying imagination. And Biographia Literaria contained many essays on philosophy. Especially there are essays on Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher. I told you in 1798, Coleridge and Wordsworth brought out the collection called the Lyrical Ballads. And without waiting for observing the response given to the collection, they went to Germany for it too. And while in Germany they separated their ways also. Coleridge went to the German universities and made friends with the German philosophers and tried to learn German language and German philosophy. Learned the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, the theory of transcendentalism. And he came to have ideas about Johann Gottlieb and Schelling. So he came to learn the German philosophy of Immanuel Kant and came into association with the philosophy of Gottlieb and Schelling. And actually, Coleridge refuted the view of Wordsworth, who maintained that there can be no difference between the language of poetry and prose. Wordsworth always maintained that there is no difference between the language of poetry and prose, and Coleridge refuted to it. According to Coleridge, the language of poetry is different from the language of prose. That poetry should provide pleasure through the medium of beauty. Coleridge always maintained that poetry should provide pleasure through the medium of beauty. And actually the most important area in the Biographia Literaria is the area where we come to find Coleridge refuting the views of Wordsworth. And it is chapter number 14. And it is this reason why In most of the Indian universities, Chapter 14 from the Biographia Literaria is prescribed as part of the syllabus. Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is the area where Coleridge answers the views of Wordsworth, refutes the views of Wordsworth. So actually chapter 14 refutes the theory put forward by Wordsworth regarding poetic composition. Wordsworth maintained that poetry did not require a special diction. So Wordsworth always opined that poetry didn't actually require a special diction. That poetry could be written in common man's language. And the chapter 14 opens with a description of how he came into friendship and understanding with Wordsworth regarding poetic composition. So in 1795 they became friends and they came to an agreement with regard to poetic composition. So when they planned to bring out a collection, they decided to write poetry on a certain agreement. And Wordsworth was to write about natural objects and make them appear supernatural. And as far as Coleridge was concerned, he had to deal with supernatural and to make them appear natural. And it was the agreement made between the poets. Wordsworth was asked to write about natural things and give them a color of supernatural. And Coleridge was asked to deal with supernatural beings and make them appear natural. And in both situations, they will have to bring a willing suspension of disbelief on the part of the reader. And the reader must be made to believe it. A willing suspension of the disbelief. So the reader may disbelieve what the poet says, but the disbelief must be suspended. So it should be thrown out, driven away from the mind of the reader. Wordsworth was asked to write about natural and to make them appear supernatural. And Coleridge was to write about the supernatural and to make them appear natural. And at the same time, both poets were asked to suspend the disbelief in the mind of the readers. They will have to make the readers believe in what they say. When Wordsworth makes the natural into supernatural, and when Coleridge makes the supernatural into natural, they will have it to make the readers believe in what they say, create a willing suspension of disbelief in the mind of the readers. And based on the agreement, Coleridge produced poems like Ancient Mariner. And Wordsworth also produced poems, so like Intimations of Immortality, Chindanabai, and many poems were produced by him, showing the natural with the color of supernatural. And Coleridge producing supernatural and making it look natural. And this was the agreement actually made between the poets before they embarked on the project of the lyrical ballads. And when a second edition of the lyrical ballads was brought out, Coleridge was not there at the time. And Wordsworth added a preface, and he claimed that he had written his poems. So his tall claim was that he had written his poems in the language of real life. So, and he said that he had written his poems in the real language of common people, in the language of common people. And in chapter 14, in the Biographia Literaria, Coleridge questions the claim of Wordsworth. And according to Coleridge, if Wordsworth's poems could make an instant appeal, if the poems of Wordsworth could make an instant appeal, it was not because of the language used by him, but in spite of it. But it was in spite of that special criteria. In the opinion of Coleridge, If the poems of Wordsworth could make a sudden appeal or an instant appeal, it was not because of the language, but in spite of it. There was no such language used by Wordsworth in his poems. Any of the poems of Wordsworth produced instant appeal in the readers. And Coleridge is also of the same view that Wordsworth is a powerful poet, and his poems have a sudden and strong appeal in the readers. But it is not because of the language used in the poems the people become interested. And they become interested on various other points, not because of the language of the common man. And Coleridge in the Biographia Literaria discusses poetry in general. And he claims that poetry is different from prose. Actually, Wordsworth maintained that prose and poetry are to be written in same language. But Coleridge refuted it and always maintained that poetry should be written in a different language, not in the same language of prose. Because in poetry there is meter and there is always rhyme. And he cites an example. So we may think that if there is rhyme and meter in a few lines, it can be considered as poetry. When Coleridge says that in poetry there must be rhyme and meter, we should not make the mistake of thinking the lines like 30 days in September, April, June and November. There is rhyme. And we can find a metrical composition also in the lines. But it is not to be called a real piece of poetry. There is meter, there is rhyme in the lines. 30 days in September, April, June and November. So the first line ends with the word September and the next line ends with the word November. And both words end in the same note. You can say A, but there is only the meter and the rhyme. So the content is very poor. But it could not constitute poetry because poetry must produce pleasure and project moral truth. In the opinion of Coleridge, poetry should produce pleasure and project some moral truth. And Coleridge always maintained that great poetry should be pleasurable in every aspect. The finer spirit of genius must plunge headlong like a waterfall. The finer spirit of genius, say the mind of the poet, should plunge headlong into a waterfall. So poetry is like jumping into a waterfall. The finer spirit of genius must plunge headlong into a waterfall. And in some cases, poetry could be written without meter also. And meter and rhyme should not be considered as the basic criteria for a poetry. And these are the essentials as far as poetry is concerned. There must be some meter and rhythm used in poetry. Otherwise, it will appear like prose. And there is always a difference between prose and poetry. And in some cases, according to Coleridge, poetry can be written without a meter. For example, the writings of Plato and some passages in the Old Testament are poetry of the highest kind, even though there is no meter or rhyme. So the writings of Plato and the passages in the Old Testament are poetry of the superior kind, poetry of the highest kind. So poetry can be written even without a rhyme and meter. And Coleridge ends the chapter very interestingly with the observation that good sense is the body of poetic genius, and fancy its drapery. Motion its life, and imagination the soul. And this is one very important point that we have to remember. UGC may ask you to fill up the words by giving a few blanks. UGC may be asking you to fill up the adjectives here. For example, good sense is the body of the poetic genius. Good sense, body. And fancy its drapery. Drapery means the covering, the dress upon it. And motion, the life, and imagination is the soul. Good sense, body of poetic genius, and fancy must be its drapery. And motion, its life, and imagination is the soul of poetry. And these all are the essential requirements for good poetry. And these all are the important critical views presented in Biographia Literaria. Thank you for attending.